As America enters one of its most consequential elections in modern history, polls continue to show the two candidates are virtually tied in key swing states. Over 75 million people have already cast early ballots. The choice Americans make tomorrow will have far-reaching implications for the country and also for the rest of the world. But let's touch base now with Newzroom Afrika's Xoli Mngambi, who's live for us in Washington, D.C. And at this time, Xoli, a lot of us here back home are winding down, getting ready to go watch you from home. But for you there, the day really starting to get heated up. And one imagines what the program even looks like for those key candidates for the day.
Indeed, Naledi. Well, as you say, you guys are going to doze off in a few hours. Here, we're just waking up. It is 11:19 to be exact. It's still morning. And yeah, the focus is on the last-minute campaigning between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. And security issues, Naledi, seem to be springing up. And that's where I'm going to bring Simon Marks, our senior Washington correspondent. Simon, the National Guard troops, the understanding is that they are on alert in various states. Is that normal, or does it talk to the current period in which we're in?
Well, it depends what you mean by normal. Nothing here has been normal since 2016. So we are now, almost a decade into abnormality. Washington, D.C. is subject to a national security event designation by the authorities. That means that there are all sorts of restrictions in place in this city with a massive security presence ready to pounce if and when it's needed. We have witnessed over the last two election cycles protesters descending on the White House after the results have come through. There is nervousness here. I think you yourself saw, Xoli, businesses being boarded up in the immediate vicinity of where we are here, so close to the White House. And in all of these states, particularly the battleground states where the results of this election are a knife edge, but in other states as well, there is great nervousness about what the hours ahead might hold. We don't want to overstate it. Absolutely nothing might happen. It all may pass off completely peacefully, and we might see a traditional moment where a winner is declared and everything resolves itself. Evidence, though, over the last two election cycles suggests that that may not be likely.
Well, you've now prompted the question, Simon, because yesterday, the former President, Donald Trump, in one of these campaign speeches says they are fighting so desperately to cheat this thing, or to steal, actually, is the word he used, to steal this damn thing. These were his words. And again, it takes people back memory lane as to what happened 2020 and more specifically January of 2021. This is when people storm the Capitol Hill. Is that part of the planning here?
Donald Trump personally is unable to recognize a set of circumstances in which he can lose this election. We witnessed that in 2020, and the expectation here is that we will witness that again this year if Kamala Harris wins. The Republican Party has sent 100,000 what they call election integrity observers to polling stations all over the country. Volunteers looking out for what they argue or may argue are episodes in which the election is being rigged. Now, after the 2020 election, as you know, Donald Trump's lawyers went to 60 separate courtrooms in states all over the land in an attempt to overturn Joe Biden's election victory. Not a single judge ruled in their favor, including judges who had been appointed by Donald Trump. But as we saw, the violent uprising of January the 6th, 2021 by Donald Trump's supporters, it's not just Donald Trump who is unable to recognize the possibility of defeat. It is many of his supporters as well. They absolutely believe that there is a fundamental flaw with the way in which elections are conducted in the United States, and they and their lawyers are getting ready to try and prove that again this time around if Kamala Harris is declared the president-elect.
Let's bring in Kamala Harris into the equation. She has prompted the Gaza conflict yesterday in one of her speeches. How often has she spoken about the Middle East conflict? Because I would imagine this is a subject she's not very comfortable talking about, and more specifically, she was addressing an Arab American community.
Exactly. She was in East Lansing, Michigan. The Democrats know they've got a problem in Michigan, and it is with Arab American voters, but also not just Arab American voters, other grassroots Democrats who are critical of the Biden-Harris administration's handling of the war in Gaza. Up until now, basically all she said is she will not be silent in the face of Palestinian suffering. But last night, and it was absolutely an 11th hour intervention by the Vice President, speaking in Michigan, she went further and said that it was absolutely vital for her as President to help end the war, to get the hostages released, to bring about a situation that could ultimately lead to fresh negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians and other parties in a bid to try and create a Palestinian homeland. So this was a targeted message by Kamala Harris aimed at trying to persuade wavering Arab American voters in Michigan and elsewhere. Hugely important in a state that is a battleground where, you know, this election is on a knife edge. She's trying to mobilize them. There will be many of them who argue, as the Americans would put it, it's a day late and a dollar short.
Let's talk South Africa and the continent, because just as this election is consequential for Americans, it has implications for the rest of the world. And where I come from, South Africa, they obviously are watching this with keen interest. In fact, talking about this just yesterday, the head of international relations saying that they wish Americans well. They have no particular interest in who occupies the White House. South Africa's interests, though, are what is important here. How do you think, let's start with a Trump administration, how will it relate to South Africa and the continent?
Well, let's be honest. I mean, really honest. Donald Trump does not care about Africa at all. He has no particular interests there. He has spoken scatologically in the past about Nigeria. He has evinced very little interest in South Africa or in any other part of the sub-Saharan region. But for a government led by Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa, and for any other government around the world, there is always opportunity with Donald Trump, because everything with Donald Trump is transactional. So if you can find a way of catching his attention and persuading him that there is some sort of transactional benefit to the United States is going to benefit financially from an improved bilateral relationship with South Africa, that's the magic lever that you have to pull. The difficulty, I think, for the South African government, and we've seen other governments scrambling to do this in the last several months, is going to be to build bridges to Trump world if he gets in, because he's not going to be bringing career diplomats or foreign service officials into the State Department or the National Security Council. These are all going to be dyed-in-the-wool Make America Great Again loyalists.
It's going to be an interesting dynamic, though, Simon, if Kamala Harris is the person that occupies the White House, because the Biden administration is unwavering in its support for Israel, for example, throwing resources.
Of course.
Indeed. However, South Africa's comments at the recent BRICS summit, where the president of South Africa says this was a bilateral between him and Putin, Russia and President Putin are a friend and ally. Would that upset Kamala Harris?
It's a problem. I mean, let's be honest about the bilateral relationship between South Africa and the United States. It is not what it was. It is not even what it was when President Ramaphosa visited Joe Biden in the White House not that very many months ago. And it has been damaged partly over Ukraine. There is a failure in this city to understand why a South African government feels such loyalty to Vladimir Putin, given that the Americans do not believe that Vladimir Putin is a Soviet, and it was the Soviet Union, including Ukraine, that provided assistance to the ANC back in the apartheid era. They view here Vladimir Putin as a Russian nationalist. They don't think he's trying to put the old band back together again. They think he's trying to conquer other lands. So it bemuses them that the South African government wants to have such a warm and friendly relationship with Vladimir Putin. But it's not only South Africa that's in that boat, as we saw in the BRICS summit. I mean, at the BRICS summit, the leaders there were speaking for 45% of the world's population.
Yeah.
And the United States continues to struggle with the notion that its own influence on the world stage, particularly in Africa, is evaporating, being diluted by China's focus on Africa, China's focus on other parts of the world, and Russia's as well. So these are really complicated issues that the government in South Africa is going to have to deal with, regardless of who is in power here. If it's Harris, you're going to get more continuity in terms of tone and style and substance from the Biden administration.
Yeah.
If it's Trump, it becomes completely transactional.
Simon, I want to close off with this question around whether or not we are going to see a US-Africa policy that sees each other as equals. Well, we may not necessarily be equals, but it's a question of, do you respect me much as I respect you? And I'm saying this because there is a complaint that as much as it was America in the United Nations that endorsed for the continent to occupy 2 seats in the Security Council, it's not nearly enough because
of course
the powers, the veto powers, will not be given to those 2 African states that will sit there. And so it is a the view is that it is not an endorsement as such, because the 2 states from Africa are going to be some kind of a junior partner in the Security Council simply because they don't have veto powers.
Well, I was smiling because I thought you were going to ask me who was going to win the election. The reality in terms of that relationship with Africa, and particularly with regard to reinventing the architecture of the international system in the United Nations, is that the United States is very, very late to that discussion. And the United States has not, under successive administrations, really focused and created a strategic plan for its relationship with Africa. You'd actually have to go back, oddly, in some ways, to the presidency of George W. Bush to find a president of the United States who focused to such a degree and understood that America had interests in trying to assist Africa and trying to uplift Africa. We've just not seen that at all. I always sit through the State of the Union addresses every year, and I don't think in one of them, certainly not in the last 2, has Joe Biden ever used the word Africa. He's never referenced the continent in the State of the Union address, not even a name check for a continent. And that is pretty astounding. It speaks volumes about the extent to which the United States has taken its eye off the continent, has allowed the Chinese really to deepen their relationships with African nations, the Russians as well, and now they're playing a massive game of catch-up here. But so many other pressing problems on the agenda for a new American president: the economy, immigration, abortion rights, climate change. All of these issues inevitably come, sadly, to crowd out the necessary focus that many African governments, including South Africa, would like to see.
Indeed, America has lots of its own problems to deal with, much less what the world is trying to also get out of America. Simon Marks, thank you very much for the time being. All right, Naledi, that's the sum total of where we are. Let me try and tease the next conversation we're going to have, because we actually don't know much about Kamala Harris. We're going to have a guest that's coming from Howard University. She went there as a student. We're going to learn a little bit more about Kamala Harris. Of course, that assumes she becomes the next president of the United States. Or, again, we have to stress this, it might just be Donald Trump, because it's neck and neck. For the time being, let's throw to Moteo Khoripe with business news.